The camera clicked, capturing what should have been a perfect family moment. 7-year-old Tommy beamed between his parents, chocolate cake still smeared on his cheek, surrounded by colorful birthday decorations and torn wrapping paper. But something was missing from the frame. Someone was missing. "Step back, Betty." Emma's voice cut through the celebration like ice. "You'll ruin the photo." Betty Hughes stood frozen, her hand halfway extended toward her grandson, watching as her daughter-in-law adjusted the camera angle to deliberately exclude her from the shot. The living room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock, the same clock Betty's late husband had wound every Sunday for 37 years. "Mom, maybe you could—" her son David started, but Emma's sharp look silenced him immediately. "It's fine, dear," Betty whispered, stepping further back into the shadows. But her hands trembled as she clutched her worn purse, the same tremor that had started 6 months ago when Emma first suggested she was becoming a burden on their household. Tommy looked confused, glancing between the adults. "Why can't Grandma be in the picture?" "Because," Emma said with a sweet smile that never reached her eyes, "sometimes grown-ups need photos that look professional for Daddy's work." As the camera flashed again, capturing the perfect family of 3, Betty felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar ache of loneliness, but something harder. Something that had been sleeping for too long. The charade was about to end. Betty Hughes had been invisible for most of her 66 years, and she had grown comfortable in that space between being seen and being ignored. It wasn't always this way. Once, she had been the wife of Robert Hughes, a respected insurance executive, the mother who never missed a school play, the neighbor who brought casseroles during difficult times. But widowhood had a way of erasing a woman's identity, reducing her to an adjective: Robert's widow, David's mother, Tommy's grandmother. 3 years had passed since Robert's sudden heart attack, and Betty had been staying with David and Emma temporarily ever since. What started as a few weeks of grief recovery had somehow stretched into a permanent arrangement that no one discussed but everyone felt. The modest ranch house on Maple Street had 3 bedrooms, but Betty occupied the smallest one, formerly David's home office, sleeping on a daybed surrounded by boxes she never fully unpacked. David, her 34-year-old son, worked as a mid-level marketing manager at a tech company. He was kind-hearted but weak-willed, the type of man who avoided conflict by pretending it didn't exist. He looked remarkably like his father, the same gentle brown eyes and receding hairline, but lacked Robert's quiet strength. Where Robert had been a steady oak, David was more like a reed, bending to whatever wind blew strongest. That wind, more often than not, was Emma. Emma Hartwell Hughes was 28, blonde, and possessed the kind of aggressive ambition that some people mistook for confidence. She had married David 4 years ago, not long after landing a junior position at a prestigious marketing firm. Emma came from what she called humble beginnings, a working-class family from the other side of town, but she wore her upward mobility like armor, constantly proving she belonged in spaces she felt she had to fight to enter. To Emma, Betty represented everything she was trying to escape: modest expectations, financial limitations, and the kind of quiet contentment that came from accepting one's place in the world. Betty shopped with coupons, wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation, and seemed genuinely happy watching game shows and tending to her small herb garden by the kitchen window. "She has no ambition," Emma often complained to David after Betty had gone to bed. "She's perfectly content being ordinary." What Emma didn't understand was that Betty's ordinariness was carefully constructed. After Robert's death, she had made a conscious choice to live simply, to take up as little space as possible. The modest checks she received weren't Social Security or David's charity. They came from a trust fund worth $12 million, established by her late husband through decades of careful investments and a substantial inheritance from his childless brother. Betty could have lived anywhere, could have traveled the world, could have bought a mansion with room for a full-time staff. Instead, she chose to live in her son's crowded house, washing dishes by hand and clipping coupons, watching the family she loved slowly reveal their true characters when they thought money was scarce. The test had begun innocently enough. Betty wanted to know if David would still call every Sunday if she weren't helping with the mortgage. She wondered if Emma's smiles would remain genuine if Betty couldn't babysit Tommy while they went to expensive dinners. Most importantly, she needed to understand if her grandson would love her for herself, not for the toys and treats she could provide. But tests have a way of revealing more than we expect. Over the past 2 years, Betty had watched Emma's resentment grow like mold in a dark corner. The younger woman had started making pointed comments about Betty's contributions to the household, suggesting she should perhaps look into assisted living facilities for her own good. Emma had begun intercepting Betty's mail, commenting on her limited income in front of neighbors, and gradually isolating her from family decisions. "We can't keep carrying dead weight," Emma had whispered to David last month, not knowing that Betty's hearing was still perfectly sharp. Today's birthday party humiliation was simply the latest in a series of small cruelties designed to make Betty feel unwelcome in her own family. But as Betty sat in her small room that evening, listening to Emma's voice drift down the hallway, "Your mother really needs to understand her place," she realized the test was complete. The results were devastating, but clear. It was time to stop being invisible. The morning after Tommy's birthday party, Betty woke to the sound of hushed arguing in the kitchen. She lay still in her narrow daybed, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight streaming through her small window, and listened to her son's marriage dissolve over coffee and toast. "Can't keep pretending this is working, David." Emma's voice was sharp with frustration. "She's sucking us dry. Keep your voice down. She'll hear you. Good. Maybe she needs to hear this. Do you know what Michelle's mother-in-law did? She moved to a lovely senior community in Florida. Independent living, activities, people her own age. She's thriving." Betty had met Michelle once at a neighborhood barbecue. Her mother-in-law had been moved to Florida after suffering a mild stroke, not by choice, but by necessity disguised as kindness. "Mom's not ready for that," David said weakly. "She's still grieving Dad." "It's been 3 years, David. 3 years. And what has she contributed? She watches Tommy sometimes, when it's convenient for her. She does some light housework, badly, and we're basically supporting another adult on your salary alone." Betty's hands clenched under her thin blanket. If Emma only knew that the mortgage payments came from Betty's account, electronically transferred through a series of carefully arranged automatic payments. That the new Honda in their driveway existed because Betty had quietly co-signed the loan and made every payment. That Tommy's private school tuition, Emma's yoga classes, their weekend getaways, all of it flowed from the trust fund Robert had left behind. "She does more than you think," David offered lamely. "Like what? Burning dinner twice a week? Making the house smell like old lady perfume? David, I can't have friends over because I'm embarrassed. Your mother sits there in her ratty cardigan, watching those awful game shows with the volume too loud. She makes everything feel poor." The word hung in the air like poison. Betty had heard it before, whispered behind closed doors, implied in sideways glances. To Emma, poverty wasn't just about money. It was a spiritual failing, a lack of ambition that might be contagious. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Emma began leaving printouts from senior living facilities on the kitchen counter by accident. She started conversations about downsizing, about how much easier life would be with just the 3 of them. She arranged coffee dates with friends who had successfully transitioned their elderly parents to assisted care. "It's not about getting rid of her," Emma explained to her friend Caitlin one afternoon, unaware that Betty was tending her herb garden just outside the kitchen window. "It's about what's best for everyone. She'd have people to talk to, activities, proper care, and David and I could finally start building our real life together." "How much would it cost?" Caitlin asked. "That's the beauty of it. These places work with whatever income you have. Social security, pension, family contributions, it all gets worked out. And honestly, she can't have much saved. Robert was just an insurance guy, and she's never worked a real job." Betty's hands stilled on the basil plants. Robert was just an insurance guy who had quietly built a fortune through decades of smart investments, living below their means, and a substantial inheritance he'd never flaunted. He had been prouder of his vegetable garden than his stock portfolio, more interested in coaching David's little league team than networking at country clubs. But to Emma, if you weren't displaying wealth, you didn't have it. The psychological campaign grew more sophisticated. Emma began timing conversations for when Betty entered rooms, discussions about household budgets that painted her as a burden. She started declining social invitations because we can't leave David's mother alone for too long. She made pointed comments about space, about privacy, about what young couples needed to thrive. David, caught between the two women in his life, chose the path of least resistance. He stopped making eye contact with his mother during these conversations. He began working late more often. He started treating Betty with the careful politeness reserved for strangers, a politeness that felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. Tommy, at 7, was old enough to sense the tension, but too young to understand it. He still crawled into Betty's lap to read stories, still begged for her famous chocolate chip cookies, still treated her with the unconscious love that children give freely. But even this relationship became weaponized. "Tommy, come here," Emma would call whenever she found him with Betty. "Grandma needs her rest. Why don't you play with your iPad instead?" The message was clear. Betty was frail, tired, a burden even to a child. The isolation was methodical. Emma began screening Betty's phone calls, claiming she was helping by taking messages. She redirected Betty's mail to a P.O. box for security reasons. She suggested that Betty's old friends might be too much excitement for someone of her age and health. Betty found herself becoming smaller, quieter, more invisible with each passing day. She began questioning her own perceptions. Maybe she was becoming a burden. Maybe her presence was preventing David and Emma from building the life they wanted. Maybe love wasn't enough to justify taking up space in a world that seemed increasingly impatient with older women who no longer served an obvious purpose. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. Betty was washing dishes after dinner, a task she had taken on to feel useful, when she heard Emma on the phone in the living room. "Dr. Patterson? Hi, this is Emma Hughes. I'm calling about my mother-in-law, Betty Hughes." "Yes, that's right. I'm concerned about her mental state." "Well, she's been showing signs of confusion, memory problems. You know how it is with elderly people. I think she might need a professional evaluation for her own safety." Betty's hands went still in the soapy water. Through the doorway, she could see Emma pacing, her voice taking on the concerned, responsible tone she used when she wanted to appear reasonable. "She's been making strange financial decisions, talking to herself, forgetting important things. Yes, I'm very worried about her living situation. My husband works so much, and I'm trying to manage my career and our 7-year-old son. It's becoming unsafe for everyone." The dish slipped from Betty's trembling hands, crashing into the sink with a sound that echoed through the house like breaking glass. Emma's voice stopped abruptly. "I'll call you back, doctor." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with something between guilt and defiance. "Betty, I heard you," Betty said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Every word. It's not what you think. I'm trying to help. Help who, Emma? Help me or help yourself?" Emma's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You can't take care of yourself anymore, Betty. Someone has to make the hard decisions. And you've appointed yourself to make those decisions. David won't do it. He's too soft, too guilty. But someone has to think practically. This isn't working for anyone." Betty dried her hands slowly, methodically, buying time to think. 3 years of careful observation had led to this moment, Emma revealing exactly who she was when she thought she held all the power. "What exactly did you tell the doctor about my financial decisions?" Emma hesitated, perhaps realizing she had said too much. "Just that. You seemed confused about money sometimes, making odd choices." "What kind of odd choices?" "Well, you live like you have no money, but you always seem to have enough for little things. It's confusing, inconsistent," Betty almost smiled. In Emma's world, financial modesty was a sign of mental decline. The idea that someone might choose simplicity over display was literally incomprehensible. "I see," Betty said. "And you think I need professional help to manage my confusion? I think you need support, structure, a safe environment with people who understand elderly care." The euphemisms flowed like honey, sweet and sticky, designed to trap Betty in a web of false concern. But Betty had been watching Emma weave this web for months, adding strand by strand until she felt ready to deliver the killing blow. It was time to remind Emma that some spiders were more dangerous than others. Betty excused herself quietly from the kitchen, leaving Emma standing there with her mouth slightly open, perhaps surprised by the lack of tears or protestations. Betty had given Emma exactly what she expected: a meek retreat, the behavior of someone who knew they were beaten. In her small bedroom, Betty sat on the edge of her daybed and reached for her phone. Her fingers, steady now despite everything, scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Harrison, Pemberton & Associates. This is Jennifer speaking. Jennifer, this is Betty Hughes. I need to speak with William Harrison immediately. Tell him it's about the Maple Street property. There was a brief pause. One moment, please, Mrs. Hughes. Within seconds, William Harrison's warm voice filled the line. Betty, good heavens, it's been months. How are you holding up? William had been Robert's financial advisor, and later Betty's, though she had deliberately minimized contact to maintain her cover. He was one of only 3 people who knew the full extent of her wealth, the others being her accountant and the trust attorney. I'm well, William, but I need you to prepare some documents for me. Can you meet tomorrow morning? Of course. What kind of documents? Betty glanced at her closed bedroom door, listening to Emma's voice drifting down the hallway as she called David at work, no doubt reporting on their kitchen confrontation. I need a complete financial disclosure statement. Every account, every investment, every property, and I need documentation of all payments made on behalf of David Hughes and his family over the past 2 years. There was a long silence. Betty, are you sure? Once that information comes out, it's time, William. It's past time. Should I also prepare the paperwork for the foundation we discussed? The one in Robert's memory? Betty closed her eyes. She and Robert had talked about creating a charitable foundation someday, when they were older, when David was more established. They had dreamed of helping children who had lost parents, providing scholarships and support systems. Robert would have loved seeing his name attached to something meaningful. Yes, draw up everything. I want it ready to execute immediately. After hanging up, Betty sat in the growing darkness of her room, listening to the house around her. Emma was in the living room now, her voice animated as she spoke to someone. Probably her friend Caitlin, or maybe her sister. Betty could hear fragments. Finally putting her foot down. And, what's best for everyone? She could hear David's key in the front door. His tired footsteps, Emma's immediate rush to intercept him. Their voices became urgent whispers, and Betty knew Emma was giving her version of events, painting herself as the reasonable one, the responsible daughter-in-law who had been forced to have a difficult conversation. Tommy's voice cut through the adult tension. Where's Grandma? I want to show her my math test. Grandma's resting, sweetie. She's had a long day. Betty's heart broke a little more. Even Tommy was being trained to see her as fragile, tired, someone who needed to be managed rather than included. The next morning, Betty dressed carefully in her best navy suit, the one she had worn to Robert's funeral, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne from when she had cried into his shoulder at their last anniversary dinner. She applied lipstick with a steady hand and pinned her silver hair into a neat bun. When she emerged from her room, Emma was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming slightly. She looked up with surprise. My, don't you look nice. Do you have an appointment somewhere? Yes, Betty said simply. I'm meeting with my financial advisor. Emma's face flickered with something, curiosity perhaps, or concern that Betty might be making more confused financial decisions. Oh, well that's good. It's important to stay on top of these things. Do you need David to drive you? I've called a car service. This was partially true. William was sending his driver, but Betty saw no need to explain that her financial advisor commanded the kind of resources that included personal drivers and immediate availability. A car service? Emma's eyebrows rose. Betty, those can be expensive. Maybe we should talk about... It's handled, Betty said, accepting the cup of coffee Emma offered out of habit. Thank you for your concern. The black Lincoln arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. Betty watched Emma peek through the living room curtains, her expression puzzled. The car was too nice, the driver too professional. It didn't fit with her narrative of Betty as a woman living on the financial edge. As Betty walked toward the door, Tommy came running down the stairs in his school uniform. "Grandma, you look fancy. Where are you going?" Betty knelt down to his level, smoothing his unruly hair. "I'm going to take care of some business, sweetheart. I'll see you later. Are you coming back?" The question was innocent, but it pierced through Betty's composure like an arrow. "Yes, Tommy, I'm coming back." But even as she said it, Betty knew that the woman who returned would not be the same one leaving. The Betty who had spent 3 years making herself small and invisible was about to step out of the shadows permanently. Emma watched from the doorway as Betty settled into the Lincoln's leather seats. Through the window, Betty could see her daughter-in-law's face cycling through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been the first flicker of fear. Good, Betty thought. It was time for Emma to understand what uncertainty felt like. As the car pulled away from Maple Street, Betty felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the thrill of being underestimated by someone who was about to learn exactly how dangerous that could be. Betty returned home at 3:30 that afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio that William had insisted she take. For dramatic effect, he had said with a wink, Robert would have appreciated the theater of it all. Inside the portfolio were documents that would reshape everything. Comprehensive financial statements showing her $12.3 million net worth, transaction records proving she had secretly funded David and Emma's lifestyle for 2 years, and the completed paperwork establishing the Robert Hughes Foundation for Orphaned Children. She found Emma in the living room, pacing while talking on her phone. When Emma saw her, she quickly ended the call. "There you are." "I was getting worried. How did your meeting go?" "Very well, thank you." Betty set her portfolio on the coffee table and took her usual seat in the corner chair, the one Emma had gradually pushed further from the center of the room over the months. Good. Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want you to know that David and I only want what's best for you. We've been looking into some wonderful facilities. Emma. Betty's voice was quiet but carried something new, an authority that made the younger woman stop mid-sentence. "Please sit down. We need to talk." Something in Betty's tone made Emma comply, though she perched on the edge of the sofa like she might need to run. "I owe you an apology," Betty began. Emma blinked, clearly not expecting this. "Oh, well, I've been dishonest with you and David for 3 years, living here under false pretenses." A small smile played at the corners of Emma's mouth. This was better than she had hoped. Betty was going to confess to some deception, perhaps providing Emma with ammunition for her campaign to have her removed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been testing your character. Yours and David's, and I'm afraid you've both failed spectacularly." The smile froze on Emma's face. "I don't understand." Betty opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document, a bank statement from Goldman Sachs showing an account balance of $8,147,392.15. "This is one of 7 accounts I maintain, the smallest one." Emma stared at the paper, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "That can't be right. You live on Social Security. You clip coupons. I chose to live modestly. There's a difference." Betty produced the next document, a detailed transaction history showing monthly transfers to David's mortgage company, his car loan, Tommy's school. "For the past 2 years, I have quietly paid your mortgage, your car payments, Tommy's private school tuition, and supplemented your household budget with an additional $3,000 per month. The total comes to $162,000. Emma's hands shook as she reached for the papers. "This is impossible. David would have told me. David doesn't know. The payments were arranged through shell companies and trust accounts. He believes his salary covers your lifestyle because that's what I wanted him to believe." The front door opened, and David's voice called out, "I'm home." He appeared in the living room doorway, loosening his tie, and stopped short when he saw Emma's white face and Betty's documents spread across the coffee table. "What's going on?" "Sit down, son," Betty said gently. "Please." David remained standing, his eyes darting between the 2 women. "Mom, Emma called me at work. She said you seemed confused about some financial things." "I'm not confused at all. In fact, I've never been more clear about anything in my life." Betty stood and handed David the bank statement. She watched his face change as the numbers registered. "I don't understand. How do you... Where did this— Your father was a very smart man with money, David, smarter than anyone realized. And I've been a very patient woman. I wanted to know who you really were when you thought money was scarce. I wanted to know if Emma would love you when she believed you couldn't provide for her properly. I wanted to know if you would both still value me when you thought I was a burden instead of a blessing. David sank onto the sofa next to his wife, the papers scattered between them like evidence at a crime scene. You've been paying for everything? His voice was barely a whisper. Everything. The house, the cars, Tommy's education, your vacations, Emma's yoga classes and shopping trips. All of it. Emma found her voice, though it came out as a croak. Why? Why would you do this to us? I didn't do anything to you, Emma. I gave you everything you asked for and more. What you did with that gift, how you chose to treat the person you believed was dependent on your charity, that was entirely your choice. Betty reached into the portfolio one final time and withdrew the foundation paperwork. Your father and I always planned to give our money away eventually. We wanted to help children who had lost their parents, like so many of the families we knew through his work. Today, I've established the Robert Hughes Foundation for Orphan Children. It will receive the entirety of my estate. No. The word tore from David's throat. Mom, you can't. I can and I have. The papers are signed, witnessed, and filed. Every penny that you believed you were entitled to will instead go to children who have lost everything but still treat others with kindness. Emma stood abruptly, her face flushed with rage. You vindictive old— Careful, Betty interrupted. The next words out of your mouth will determine whether I continue Tommy's education funding or not. The threat hung in the air like smoke. For the first time in 3 years, Betty held all the power, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Emma remained frozen, her mouth half open, while David stared at the financial documents as if they might spontaneously combust. Finally, Tommy's voice drifted from the kitchen where he was having his after-school snack. Mom, is Grandma okay? She sounds different. The sound of her grandson's voice seemed to break Emma's paralysis. She sank back onto the sofa, her hand pressed to her forehead. This is insane. You've been lying to us for years. I've been protecting myself, Betty corrected. And learning who you really are when the masks come off. David finally looked up from the papers. Mom, I didn't know you were paying for everything. If I had known. What would you have done differently, David? Would you have stopped Emma from calling me a burden? Would you have defended me when she excluded me from family photos? Would you have stood up to her when she started planning to have me declared mentally incompetent? David's face crumpled. She wasn't really going to— She called Dr. Patterson yesterday, asked him to evaluate my mental state. She's been building a case to have me removed from this house and placed in a facility against my will. That's not— I was trying to help, Emma started. You were trying to steal my life, Betty said simply. And you very nearly succeeded. Betty gathered the documents and returned them to her portfolio. I'll be moving out tomorrow. I've purchased a lovely condominium downtown, near the park where Tommy and I used to feed the ducks. You have 30 days to arrange alternative financing for your mortgage, car payments, and Tommy's school. 30 days? David's voice cracked. Mom, we can't possibly— You managed just fine before I started helping. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Emma shot to her feet, her composure finally shredding completely. You can't do this to Tommy. He's innocent in all of this. Tommy is the only reason I'm giving you 30 days instead of 30 minutes, Betty replied. And he's the only reason I'm continuing his education funding. But those payments will go directly to the school, not through you. She stood and walked toward the hallway, then paused. Oh, and Emma? I've arranged for my attorney to send Dr. Patterson a complete psychological evaluation I had done today. From a different doctor, one who found me to be in perfect mental health with no signs of confusion or incompetence. He'll be very interested to learn about your phone call. Emma's face went white. Making false claims about someone's mental capacity to a medical professional was a serious matter, potentially criminal. Betty found Tommy in the kitchen, chocolate milk mustache adorning his upper lip. He looked up at her with the pure love that only grandchildren can offer. Grandma, Mom and Dad sound upset. Are they fighting? They're having a grown-up conversation, sweetheart. Sometimes those sound louder than they need to. Are you sad? You look different today. Betty knelt down and took Tommy's small hands in hers. I'm not sad, Tommy. I'm free. Do you know what that means? He shook his head, chocolate milk forgotten. It means I get to be myself again. The real me. And the real me wants to take you on adventures and teach you things, and love you exactly the way you deserve to be loved. Will you still live here? No, sweetie. I'm going to live in a new place. But you can visit me anytime you want. We'll have sleepovers and make pancakes and read stories until very late. Tommy's face brightened. Can we still feed the ducks? Every weekend if you want to. 6 months later, Betty stood in the spacious lobby of the newly opened Robert Hughes Foundation Children's Center. The building hummed with activity, social workers meeting with families, children attending after-school programs, support groups for young people navigating grief. Framed photographs of Robert lined the walls, showing him coaching Little League, volunteering at soup kitchens, reading to children at the library. Mrs. Hughes, a young social worker, approached, carrying a clipboard. The Peterson family is here for their appointment. They wanted to thank you personally for the scholarship program. Betty nodded, smoothing her emerald green dress, a far cry from the faded cardigans she had worn for 3 years. Her silver hair was professionally styled now, and her eyes sparkled with purpose. Tommy bounded into the lobby, followed by David, who looked older than his 34 years. The past months had been difficult for him, downsizing to a smaller apartment, taking a second job, watching Emma file for divorce when she realized the money was truly gone forever. Grandma! Tommy launched himself into her arms. I brought my report card. I got all A's. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. David approached more slowly. Mom, I wanted to apologize. Again. I know I can never... David. Betty placed a gentle hand on his arm. You're here. You bring Tommy to see me every week. You're working hard to rebuild your life with integrity. That's enough. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was peace. David had lost his inheritance, his marriage, and his comfortable life, but he had found something more valuable, the knowledge of who he really wanted to be. Emma sends her regards, David said quietly. Betty raised an eyebrow. Emma had moved back in with her parents and taken a job at a different marketing firm. She had not spoken to Betty since the day of the revelation. She's in therapy, David continued, trying to understand why she became someone she doesn't recognize. Betty nodded. Growth is possible at any age, for all of us. As she watched Tommy explore the children's center, pointing excitedly at the art therapy room and the reading corner, Betty felt Robert's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. This was what they had dreamed of. A legacy built on love instead of money, measured in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. At 66, Betty Hughes had learned that it was never too late to stop being invisible, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, and never too late to transform pain into purpose. The test was over. The real life had finally begun.